Welcome back to the Southeastern 14 podcast. I'm your host, Chris Lee, back after a couple weeks break to get the batteries recharged as football season is approaching. Media days behind us. Blake, and boy, the spotlight got stolen from that pretty quickly by news a little bit to the west.
Yeah, it did. SEC Media Days, of course, for last week. And just a quick plug, we do have some stuff on the site there from that. So I thought you kind of get sometimes with Media Days, you get some answers that, coach speak, I think, to a certain extent. Some stuff is pretty good. Then you have others like, Mike Leach and Eli Drinkwitz and those kind of guys who just really don't hold back on anything. But yeah, like you said, that was sort of looking at the different storylines with those teams and such. We thought would be sort of the main focus of last week, but then looks like that Texas and Oklahoma were the ones to kind of spoil the party there because they may actually be joining the party here pretty soon. So yeah, a pretty wild week, and I think really a week we may look back on down the road and say that's sort of the week that changed everything, not just for the SEC, but maybe for college athletics in general moving forward.
Has there ever been a 2 or 3 week or a month stretch where you've seen the landscape of college sports change? And we're projecting here, right? I mean, obviously things are going to change with name, image, and likeness, and with Texas and Oklahoma apparently heading to the SEC. So we know there is some imminent change, but part of this is the projection of what's ahead and just where this is going. Have you ever been more bewildered and just befuddled in your life in terms of trying to figure out where things are headed with college sports?
Yeah, I mean, I think back and I feel like when it was first introduced, like the name, image, and likeness stuff, we kind of said that things were going to change in terms of, how everything would look really overall. But now when you combine that with, that goes through, what was it, 1st of July, whatever it was. Now we're sitting here, not even through July yet, and we're talking about a complete shift potentially in the conferences and how they're set up and just the entire landscape. Who knows what happens with the Big 12 after this? You're looking at the SEC, maybe not just going to 16, but I don't know if down the road maybe they add more, which I know we'll talk more about this just with the reports and such of some of the other teams that were mentioned out there. I don't know what the validity is on those, but I think we do know there is something to the Texas and Oklahoma part. But it's wild, yeah. I mean, because the coaches, that's what we were talking about too last week at Media Days was, they're talking about all this name, image, and likeness stuff, having no idea where things go from here. Now it's like, well, you've got that, the transfer portal, which we've talked about. I mean, that's become something too that's such a big dynamic in college sports. And so you add these three big things together: realignment, NIL, transfers, all this, and it's just it's a much different looking situation than you had even a couple of years ago, I guess, at this point.
Okay, Blake, so you're sitting there covering Media Day, probably keeping an eye on Twitter, whatever goes into that in your process. What is that like for you as this news breaks and as you're seeing people react to it in real time?
I mean, it's kind of fun to see all the reactions because, as we know, I mean, we're in the social media era. There's a reaction to everything. But I think my first thought, honestly, is when you hear this, my first thought is, okay, well, what about Texas A&M? Like, as crazy as it sounds, like that was one of my first thoughts was, boy, I wonder what Texas A&M thinks about this because, as we know, that's sort of a situation. We talk about having layers. Like, that's a situation that has layers to it with the whole Texas A&M, Texas dynamic and everything that's kind of gone along with it. So that was one of the first things. And, that was one of the first things, too, that a lot of people mentioned was what are others thinking about this? I mean, if something like that comes out, that's not something that's just, Texas and Oklahoma didn't wake up on Wednesday or Thursday or whatever it was and decide, hey, you know what, we're going to go to we're going to put we're going to the SEC. Like, this just didn't come out of thin air. This has been something that has undoubtedly been in the works longer than any of us have known. And so I think that's where you start to dig a little bit when you hear something like that comes out. You start to think, okay, there's a lot of pieces you have to connect here, and that's where it's like, all right, how long has this been going on? What could this look like? How soon could this happen? What is Texas A&M going to think? What's Missouri going to think? Like, there's a lot of different questions. I think that when I first looked at it, and you see people reacting, like you said, I think it was more questions than anything about, all right, what's next, and is this actually going to be a possibility? And then I think you naturally use your imagination from there to say, well, if it is Texas and Oklahoma, does it stop there? Like, who else is gonna? What else comes of this? Like, because I don't think it does stop there. I think that once you add a couple more, I think from there, this is going to be something where I don't think this just goes to 16. I think it probably gets to a higher number. I don't know how quickly. Maybe it's 5 years, 10 years. I have no idea. But I think this sort of expedites the process of going from the traditional landscape right now with what the power conference setup is to like this is the SEC, like this mega conference that goes to 20, 24 teams, something like that. I have no idea.
Well, I have some more thoughts on that in just a moment in terms of where things are headed. And of course, I think we need to get into the Oklahoma, Texas to the SEC impact part of things. But I think the thing that amazed me the most, Blake, is how quiet they kept this. Apparently, this has been brewing since February. My understanding, and I'm not breaking news here, just confirming, I think, what other people have reported and thought. This apparently originated from the Oklahoma, Texas camp. But I just couldn't believe that this has been going on that long and it got kept that quiet. Not that the discussion ever happened, but I would have thought that if something like this happened, there would have been a leak somewhere within days. I mean, whoever was involved in these talks, they need to quit football. They need to go work in national security somewhere. It's crazy. I cannot believe how long this has been kept quiet.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing because we know this is sort of the era now where a lot of the stuff that gets out. I mean, we know, like, ahead of time when stuff is kind of around the corner with certain things, in sports and college athletics and that type of stuff. And so it's incredible to think that something this big that could shift a landscape as much as it could has just been sitting there for months, and we've not even thought about the possibility of that scenario. So it's not something we see very often these days, and yeah, it's going to be interesting to see, I think, what the next step is.
All right, let's talk to Texas and Oklahoma joining the SEC. One speculated motive, I think, is that Texas looked over at A&M and said, hey, look, this is a program that gained its brand or added to its brand, whatever word you want to choose. And we're kind of sitting here stuck in neutral. I think Texas, you look back a few years, it hired Tom Herman. That didn't go the way it wanted. Same thing with Shaka Smart. And Texas is sitting up looking at its neighbor going, okay, A&M has joined the SEC, and now this is the team that's right on the verge of playoff contention. Now, Oklahoma already there, right? So I think when you look at it from the Texas-Oklahoma standpoint, the branding that you get from joining the SEC was the driver, and, of course, it's obvious, right?
Yeah, I think so. And I guess if you want to compare, like if we compare, let's say the tip top, like college football powers traditionally, like I'm sure there's one I'm not thinking of, but like I think you put Texas in that group of programs that has fallen the most based on maybe, I guess you could say where they once were, but again, we could put different programs in there. Like, Florida State's obviously not been in a great situation, and different ones. But I think if you look at Texas, knowing that that's what they value the most is, not just the college football, but really just the revenue that's something that brings in with that sport. You want to be able to get back to seeing, okay, we see what Alabama's done, right? Like we see, like you just said, what A&M has been able to do, not necessarily from just winning national championships or anything, but just from being able to have that sort of SEC backing and what has come along with that, with the SEC Network and ESPN and all this other stuff. That's really raised the profile of everyone in the SEC to a certain extent. And so, I mean, I don't think it's, once you look at it more, do I think this is surprising at all that you would see, someone like Texas and Oklahoma want to be a part of that? Absolutely not. I think that it makes sense when you look at it and you kind of look at the state of the Big 12, I think, overall, too, because I mean, it's been like not just football, but like there has been frustrations in the Big 12 in recent years. And we know that. Like there have been things that, you kind of look at, and it's been an up and down situation, I think, with just the conference itself. And so now you're looking at it and you're seeing that the SEC is kind of on this upward trend and has been for a while. But I think you just look at it and you're like, all right, there's a lot of revenue opportunity. Football is what we value the most, even though, as we said, we know that they have a national title contender, baseball regularly. Now they've got Chris Beard in basketball. I think they're going to be a perennial top 10 team every year as long as he's there. So you're seeing the trajectory of some of their top sports really, go up. But like in football, you also want to be able to get back to where you were, and you want to be kind of that in that same mold as Alabama and Clemson and all these teams that have kind of gotten to that level. So yeah, it is. I can't say I'm surprised at all, but it is something where you can certainly see the appeal if you're somebody like that and have the motivations that you do, like Texas does.
Yeah, and I'm wondering the effect on the teams in the middle, the bottom, the
Yeah.
Vanderbilts of the world in football. Maybe for the moment, South Carolina, that has not always been true of the Gamecocks. Tennessee, for right now, I do wonder how much tougher it makes for that bottom group, however you define it. Don't get hung up on the names I mentioned. It's the principle that we're talking about. Does adding those teams to the league raise the brain of everybody to the point where it helps, or to just make it that much tougher to climb back to relevance?
Well, and I am going to specifically mention the program, and you don't have to, like you said a couple of them, but like I do think Vanderbilt is the one I look at and say, let's say, for instance, Texas, Oklahoma, we think this is happening. Okay. That's where I think football, yeah, like basketball, baseball, I think it's, like I said, if you do add those two, I mean, Texas, I mentioned, I think Texas is going to be a top 10 team every year now in basketball. So I think that's essentially adding another Kentucky, which, a little different, but I think that's essentially what you're going to be doing if you add Texas. As long as Chris Beard is there, I think they're going to be that same tier. So that's a challenge. Oklahoma, look, they just got a new coach in Porter Moser. You would expect he's going to have them at some point in the near future being right up there as a top 25 team regularly too. So there's another challenge. But in football, let's say you go to the pod, and I think this is a much bigger discussion in terms of how do you schedule this? How do you go about putting together divisions or pods or flex scheduling, or how are you going to do this? But if you are a Vanderbilt, and we've seen, all of us who have, or if you're listening to this, and we've all seen the stuff out there, the proposed possibilities with the pods and everything. And I know one of them was, you put Vanderbilt in there with Tennessee, Alabama, and Auburn. Well, in football, that's not ideal. If that comes out a situation where you have to play Alabama, Auburn, well, you play Tennessee already every year, but if you have to play Alabama and Auburn now every season, that's just more challenging, right? And then I think it's, okay, you're adding two more teams. Well, we know, what does that mean? That means you're going to add another conference game. And if you continue to add teams, you're only going to add more conference games as you go along, to where does there come a day where the SEC only plays, one or two non-conference games, or maybe doesn't play non-conference games at all? I think those are realistic possibilities at some point down the road. And I think if you're Vanderbilt, and who was it? Someone else, was it? I don't want to attach it to the wrong person, but I think it was Mark Stoops, who last week at Media Day was talking about, if you're Kentucky, you're playing an SEC only schedule last year, which we know, Vanderbilt, it didn't work out at all. But even for like a team like Kentucky, and you go to playing an SEC only schedule, there are challenges with that. And especially, like we said, if you go and you add more of these teams, and maybe you're someone who all of a sudden, let's say you get another conference game added, and whoops, here it is. Like you get Oklahoma added, or you get Texas added to your already tough schedule where you have to play Alabama and A&M and LSU and all these other teams. It's just, I don't know if that helps or hurts, because yes, you're going to have the revenue coming in and all this, but if I'm a recruit and I'm trying to grow the program, if I'm a coach, and I'm looking at this and I'm seeing the gap and maybe how big it is between the top and the bottom, then you start to look at those teams at the bottom and say, where is the path upward, and is there a path upward? I think that's a big question.
Well, let's back out of just the SEC and the ramifications for those two teams joining the conference. I mean, there's been speculation that I think that Barstool tweeted this out about Michigan and Ohio State have been talking to the SEC. I don't know how much credence I put into that. I think Clemson and Florida State were also mentioned in that tweet. But put that aside for a minute. I think where people have privately speculated that this is headed, and this makes sense, right? I think this is going to be, and again, I'm not breaking news here, so let's get that out of the way. Everybody thinks this is headed to 16-team leagues. And then, as someone I talked to this morning who's pretty well connected in this world said to me, at that point, there's been some talk that it's not so much what conference you're in, but that you're in, and I'm paraphrasing here, but that you're in one of those, and there may be a rebalancing to where the SEC may not look like the SEC. I don't know if it's a geographic rebalancing, which frankly at that point you kind of almost have to do because you look at the SEC in football, and I hate to keep picking on Vanderbilt, but they're the one that's been at the bottom of the pool for the longest. You look at that, you go back to the pod system that you mentioned, Blake.
Yeah.
If Vanderbilt goes 1-2 against Auburn, Alabama, Tennessee, that's a historic year.
Yeah.
For them. And then you got to figure out where else the wins come from and who else is on your schedule. And so the point being, teams can get buried pretty quickly. It would be interesting to me if this does go to a thing where it's not, okay, we're in the SEC, but we're in one of those four conferences and maybe the four get together and figure out, I don't know if the revenue structure would be equal across the board. Obviously, we'd be talking, I think, about and I guess this is speculative, but a breakaway from the NCAA because, I mean, look where we're headed. It's money-driven, and you've seen how long the NCAA has fought all the changes with name, image, and likeness and all those things. But I think that's the next thing is once these dominoes fall, where does it go, and what does conference structure look like, say, a decade from now? Is it really that you're in the SEC, or is it that you're in one of those conferences, so to speak?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think that's a big question in terms of, I think it's just, I don't think, for a Texas and Oklahoma and teams like that, I think this is only a beneficial type move. And I know you can look at that from the outside and say, well, perhaps they're going to be playing a much more challenging schedule, and that type of stuff. But I think in the long run, I think it's very beneficial knowing that, like you just said, maybe this is the path we're moving towards where you have these 16-team conferences. And if you're going to get one, if you're going to get in one, like this is probably the one to get in. And you're going to have, sort of that opportunity, like we said, with all the Rays, just possibilities, I think, that are out there just in terms of what the SEC we've seen accomplished in recent years. But also, it is one where it's, if just depending on how the scheduling falls and how that process looks for certain programs, it becomes a much bigger challenge. I mean, look, even for like a team like Arkansas, right? I mean, I think Arkansas is a program that's also we've seen in recent years, like they've hit the bottom. But, what happens if maybe you structure it in a certain way where not only do you still have sort of your SEC West opponents, but either let's say you get Texas out in there, Oklahoma. Well, then you add that to Alabama, LSU, A&M, Auburn, Ole Miss is on the way up. Mississippi State and just a different, unique offense. Like that's where do those wins come? And I think that's just, unfortunately, it's always the case. When you have this realignment, there are just some teams that have struggled or programs that have struggled that just, it only makes it tougher for them. And I think in this scenario, that would pretty much be the same thing when we're looking at some of these teams that have really not been able to sort of find their footprint on a consistent basis in the SEC already. And then if you just add more strength to it, then I think it only makes the challenge tougher.
Okay, let me ask you another thing, and I haven't heard this mentioned a lot. Maybe you have, but if it goes to a 16 or 4 16-team conferences making 64 teams, which is a logical number for tournament play and whatever else, what happens to Notre Dame?
Yeah. Well, I think at some point with Notre Dame, I think they've got to, I mean, we know that they have stuck to it, but I think at some point they're going to be. I think they've already gotten there. Honestly, I think that it's hurt them more than not in some instances. Even though, yes, you can say, all right, well, they've gotten into the college football playoff and all this other stuff recently, but I think at some point it's going to be. I think the landscape is going to change to the point to where they're not going to have a choice but to find a spot somewhere, even though they don't want to, and we know that. Like it's just that they've always kind of stuck to it, but I really don't think they're going to have a choice at some point very soon. Because again, that's where it's like, okay, if you add Texas and Oklahoma, and you start to compile this college football playoff, which who knows kind of what that's going to look like. I think now, knowing that, yes, they proposed the 12-team thing and all this, but if you have these shifting landscapes eventually, what does that look like in terms of actual selection process and all that? I think those are more questions that you have to ask now that this is sort of shifting the way that it is. But I mean, for Notre Dame, I just think they've got to at some point find somewhere, because otherwise, like you said, are they going to be able to get the games that they have been able to put together scheduling wise? If you see sort of the way these revamp conferences and maybe how they're doing schedules and all that, where do the games come from? Because Notre Dame's not going to get there, by beating Army and Navy and BYU. Like that's not just going to get them to the national championship, college football playoff. Like that's just, you're going to have to find those games somewhere. And what if those opportunities aren't available based on increased number of conference games for teams like in the SEC or elsewhere? Then I think that's the big question.
Well, here's the other question, okay? You have, in two of the three sports we cover football, baseball, basketball, and this especially applies to basketball. I mean, a lot of the fun of the tournament, I mean, sure, everybody loves to see, at least the TV people for certain, and those who like to see the blue blood standing at the end to battle it out because it makes a better product, which I'm not arguing with that. But what makes the NCAA tournament in basketball so much fun is those 4-13 games. It's the 15 out of the America East or somewhere that occasionally knocks off a Syracuse or someone like that. You lose so much if you just make this, let's say we're going to go to a 64-team tournament again, and it's just the teams that are in those 4 alleged 16-team conferences. What do you do with the NCAA basketball tournament then? I mean, is there some kind of a happy medium here where the other side just goes, hey, we know we're lost. We know we need to tap into some of this revenue. Let's come together in the postseason, and we'll bring our teams, and you bring your teams, and we'll try to pretend things are as they once were for the sake of this one event. I'm really curious to see how this works to lesser extent in baseball, because I think a lot of times the big dogs, the LSUs, the Vanderbilts, those are the teams that are standing at the end in baseball. And basketball, you may be left with Butler and Duke at the end. I mean, this can go a lot of ways, as we've seen, or VCU in the Final Four, any number of teams that you could pick there. To me, the big question of what happens next is what happens with the NCAA basketball tournament as we know it now.
Yeah, it'll be different. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt about it because, again, and we know too in basketball, just like in the other sports, but, in basketball, there is a reliance too, just on the sort of advanced stuff. I mean, we've seen, Ken Pom and that kind of stuff just kind of be something that's become like such a regularly used system to be able to place these teams and to figure all this stuff out to compile a tournament each and every year. And okay, again, if Texas and Oklahoma are added to the mix and the SEC all of a sudden they're to 16 teams, and like you said, let's say the other conferences go to 16 as well. It's just, I mean, when you look at the numbers, those are probably going to stand out over some of the other, smaller, mid-major, low-major conferences you're comparing to, and you're going to maybe have the tendency to take those teams and add them to the mix versus the others. And that's another thing I worry about. We talk about increased conference games, right? The SEC, we've seen conferences already move to it. Like, what is it, the Big Ten, and some of the others have already moved to increased number of conference games during the regular season in basketball. Well, I think the more you move towards bigger conferences, again, you're going to move towards more conference games. And I think that's where, okay, you have to remove games non-conference wise, and you start to lessen the amount of games that you play against mid-major schools, which, by the way, need those games revenue-wise in a lot of cases. But those games start to go away. And where do they get that from? Are they just going to play each other? They're not going to get the same type of impact from a revenue standpoint. They're not going to get the same type of exposure. Take for example, pick a mid-major team. It doesn't even matter. And all of a sudden, if they're playing Alabama on an ESPN, 2 game or something, versus going out and playing a team from, again, just random pick here, Big Sky or somewhere, completely different scenario. If you have to replace those kind of games, it's just, I think that's another thing you have to, that's a ripple effect. And it doesn't matter. I know if you're looking at it for the SEC, who has to do what's best for the SEC, but at the same sense, again, you're taking games away that, like I said, I understand it from the SEC standpoint. Probably taking some of those games away is a good thing, but I also worry that, for those mid-major schools and stuff that rely on these, which is the same in football, right? Like it's you play these bye games and you get your money and you go home, but that's significant. Even if you lose 65-0, there's a lot of significance that goes along with that because revenue is important, especially given what happened last year. There are some schools that need that more than ever now, but if you start to move away from it, I don't know where those games come from, and I don't know where, maybe that revenue is made up from. So,
well, the other part of the scheduling question is this. Let's just do this hypothetically speaking. Let's say that you've got a 16-team SEC that goes into effect, just for the sake of argument. It was going to go into effect this season, okay? So now you've got Oklahoma and Texas in the SEC. For basketball, I presume one of two things, maybe. You would either, and I don't think the first one is the way it would go for, money reasons. But then it gets hard, okay? Because every team, you've got 15 potential opponents. Do you stop and just say, well, we play everybody in the league once. And if Kentucky is playing Tennessee and Lexington one year, then Kentucky will play Tennessee and Knoxville the next year. Do you do that and just stop at a 15-game schedule? Or do you say, all right, we're going to use these pods as people have speculated. So let's say you're Alabama and the pods go as someone has proposed where you've got Auburn, Tennessee, and Vanderbilt in the league. If you're Alabama, do you play home and home with the other 3 teams in your pod and then play everybody else once? So that makes an 18-game schedule, what I think is what we've got now. How do you go with that scheduling aspect? We'll get to baseball in a minute, but basketball, I wonder how they would do that.
Yeah, I do too, because like you said, there are different ways you could do it, but I just don't. I still think that ultimately, and maybe I'm wrong, but I think the end goal is you want to add more conference games. I think that is. I just feel like that's going to be the direction we head in. And like you said, maybe you could set it up to where it's all right, you play everybody once because you do have, enough teams now to where it's all right, well, 15 or whatever it is, and maybe you add some more somewhere else in there, but you don't have to change it maybe all that much. And I want to say this, I don't see a scenario where all of a sudden you're just going to say, well, you've only, you wind up playing 5 non-conference games in basketball or something. I think you're going to have still a pretty good chunk of games. And I was just sort of mentioning that a minute ago as sort of the doomsday scenario situation where it's if you keep adding and adding and adding, eventually, again, that just, I think, lowers the amount of possibilities for the mid-major, low-major schools to play those kind of games. But I do think that you're still going to have those non-conference games. I mean, it's because in basketball too, we know it's different because you're playing more games. You're playing 35 or whatever it is. And so you're still going to have those games, but I think it's just at a certain point, what is that cutoff line when it comes to conference games? Because you do have so many more opportunities available. And also too, we have to think of it. It's well, if I'm sitting back from an ESPN standpoint and I'm the SEC network, well, I want content. I want live content. That's what people pay for. And so I want more games. I want more opportunities to have an SEC basketball game in prime time. So give me more games on the schedule between SEC teams so I can do that. And so I think that's another sort of business aspect that's going to come along with it. And as we know, sometimes, I mean, the SEC is going to do their thing, but a lot of stuff depends on TV too. And because there's a lot of money invested in this deal, with the SEC network and all this other stuff. So there are decisions made that have to go along with that. And so I don't know. I think that there's just going to be a lot of things they've got to figure out. But as we said, if they've been doing this since February, then they probably already started to figure out some of those things.
Yeah, I think equity in basketball scheduling with a 16-team model is the easiest to figure out.
Yeah.
I think that baseball and football are different stories. Like you already see this. We
Yeah.
talked about this year in baseball, how you looked at disparity of draw between, I think Ole Miss was on one end and I don't remember who was on the other, but like, it's a lot of times it's who you play or you don't play. And if you draw, if you're in the East and you draw the top three teams in the West as your weekend opponents, I mean that's a whole lot tougher than obviously a team that you're competing with that draws the worst three teams. So point is, there's already a lot of room for an equitable schedule distribution in a certain season, given the way the league has already stacked up. Now you add a couple more teams, which, oh, by the way, happen to both be powerhouses in baseball. At least Texas is for sure.
Yeah.
Oklahoma, is a really good team. Oklahoma's baseball is, I wouldn't say we're on level with its basketball right now, but it's been there at times. And I guess what I'm getting at again is just I see a potential for a nightmare in scheduling, not scheduling and putting it together, but just where the regular season race is going to be more heavily dependent on schedule than it's ever been before.
Here's another thing. I'm curious to see what you think about this. I know Matt Zimick, someone, a colleague I've worked with before, he mentioned one of the things he put out was, and he made a good point. The SEC network was the one that proposed or put out this proposal on the potential pod system, right? Like the potential ideas there. I don't think they put that out unless there is something along with that. Like, I don't think that the SEC network, which again, we know, like the SEC's been pretty good at sort of controlling what gets out there and what they put out from a standpoint of, look, yes, you're going to be able to give your analysis on shows and all that on the network, but I think it's interesting that they put out this pod proposal and wonder, okay, is there something to this? Maybe, all right, let's float this out there. Let's see what people think. And maybe let's revise as we see fit. Because as we said, right now, if you look at the proposal they put out on the SEC network last week, just to kind of go over this for people who maybe are like, okay, well, who's actually in these pods? Pod A would be Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, South Carolina. B, and then we're talking football here, of course. B would be Alabama, Auburn, Tennessee, Vanderbilt. C would be LSU, Mississippi State, Ole Miss, Texas A&M. And then D would be Arkansas, Missouri, Oklahoma, and Texas. I'm just kind of curious about that because, in that scenario, you would go to a 9-game conference schedule. And basically you would play the 3 other teams your pod every season. Then you play 2 teams against each of the other pods, and you would host one every 4 seasons or something like that. So you have sort of the transition there year by year with who you would play. But I'm curious if, again, maybe it is something they just come up with on the fly, but I don't think it is. I think there's probably a little more to that with actually putting it on the SEC network saying, hey, here's a proposal. I can't say I'd be shocked if maybe there's something to that more than just, oh, the SEC network decided to put this out. I think maybe there's a little more backing to that somewhere.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's not like the SEC, Texas, and Oklahoma just had discussions for 5 months and said, oh, shoot, wait, how are we going to realign the conference, right? How are we going to put these teams that are going to be divisions, pods? I'm with you. I think that there is probably something to that. And maybe floating is a good idea just to gauge the reaction. But the problem is, I mean, look, things change all the time. Tennessee, I mean, my goodness, if you've done this, back to the Alabama, Tennessee, Auburn, Vanderbilt pod. I mean, if you'd done this 20 years ago, imagine being Vanderbilt when Tennessee's, a couple years off a national title and Alabama is, always a step away from being Alabama again, which is kind of where it was at the time. I mean, Alabama was going through a drought, but you had to know that wasn't going to last long. So I don't know. I think that whatever they come up with today, we can sit here and we can say, oh, that looks good and fair or as well as they can do. But, 5 years from now, the landscape changes and somebody will have dropped off that we don't expect. And, for instance, maybe Missouri's a top 10 team again. Who knows? I mean, I'm just throwing names out there. But, I mean, it's whatever agreement we get to anyway, it's just going to be temporary. I mean, in terms of what's equitable, right?
Yeah, for sure. And like we said, there's just still there's way too many unknowns with this to know exactly where this is headed. Because like we're saying, we're assuming that maybe the direction we're going to see is the 16 team conferences, but again, who knows how much that can change if, if somebody reaches out to the SEC and like, "Oh, well, it would certainly make a lot more sense for us to maybe add this school too." And then, what does that number get to? I don't, I'm not of the opinion that we're just going to see the situation where, you're going to see the SEC go up to, to 30 or 24. I don't think we're getting to that number, but like we said, could we have predicted Texas and Oklahoma joining the SEC 5 years ago? Maybe not. So I think there's still a lot of unknowns to know exactly where this is at.
Okay, like I want to return to something for a minute, and it's all based on the idea that these are colleges and universities first, okay? And as we have seen conference expansion and conference dissolution and all these things through the years, I'll start with the Southwest Conference. One thing we lost was those natural rivalries and things, and now it's become a money grab. And I won't get into all that. I understand the reasons why, but one thing that you have lost are two things. You've lost some rivalries, and you've got some geographical headaches. West Virginia traveling halfway across the country to get to Lubbock to play games and those sorts of things. I do wonder if this does become 16-team super conferences where what conference that you're with doesn't matter as much that you're in one. I wonder if you start to see some rebalancing among geographic and rivalry lines too. I mean, I think at some point you'd have to, and I do think that's one thing that they could do that would blunt some of the criticism maybe that's going to exist, some of which I think is fair.
Yeah, like you said, I think a lot of people initially when we started seeing all this movement was, it's just like even you mentioned the West Virginia example. It's like, well, almost the schools had to go places just so they're not left out. Like that's how it kind of felt at times, where it's like, well, we better get in these places, even if we have to travel, however many miles. We better get in because we're going to get left out, not knowing the landscape. And I think that's something where you would like to see that shift back to a little bit more a lenient situation, like you said, for let's say a school like West Virginia, and those types of things. Because I think too, again, this past year, I would think has probably made schools more aware of sort of the revenue part of things, and just all that kind of stuff, and the spending and the costs and travel and all those other sort of things. So you would think that is also in the back of their mind now. It was before, but I think when you see how things shifted as much as they did over the past year, then you're like, okay, well maybe there's a better solution out there for us to be able to manage that. So I would hope so too. Maybe you do, like you said, return to having more of those sort of natural geographic rivalries and those sort of things, and have everyone a little bit closer together than maybe having just these conferences that don't make sense from a logistical and geographical standpoint. Whereas like we said, I mean Texas and Oklahoma, I mean it still makes sense because again we know that A&M is in there, and there's just geographically it still makes sense for teams in the SEC to go to one of those two places. Now, if you go over, like we said, if and we're talking about speculation here on this other part because I don't know that there's anything to it, but all the stuff out there about Michigan and Ohio State and all that, like that's where you start to get into it and say, okay, does it really make sense for Florida to go play at Michigan or that kind of stuff? Like those are a lot more, I think, headaches that come along with that kind of stuff.
Well, Blake, I think we've speculated about all we can speculate today. Any closing thoughts before we end the show?
No, it'll be interesting. Like you said, I thought that last week the biggest thing coming out of it was going to be the fact that Nick Saban put out there that Bryce Young had already earned seven figures in name, image, and likeness deals, and he hasn't even really played a meaningful snap yet for Alabama. I thought that was going to be the biggest talking point coming out of last week, but as we mentioned, that changed with the Texas and Oklahoma stuff. So there's a lot to figure out, not just conference realignment, but how coaches are going to manage NIL. They all talked about that last week. I think and again, Saban probably did say it best when he's like, I could sit here and give you an answer, but the fact is we don't know what the consequences of this are going to be. We don't know how all this is going to unfold, and I think it's putting everyone in that same situation of, hey, how do we manage this deal? How's it going to affect what we try to do actually on the field or on the court or wherever? So I think that's another thing that's sort of hanging out there right now.
All right. Well, these are crazy and unprecedented times. And as things get updated, we'll update you as well. We also have our coverage, of course, at our website, southeastern14.com, which maybe southeastern16.com before long, Blake. But whatever the name is, we'll have you covered. Be sure and follow us at 14southeastern.com, or excuse me, at 14 Southeastern on Twitter. Anyway, we'll have more podcasts coming. Not sure when the next one is. Probably do at least one more later this week. But anyway, for Blake Lovell, I'm Chris Lee. Thank you for listening to the Monday episode of the 14.